The tension in the room was unbearable. James stood at the door, his mind still spinning from the words his wife, Kate, had just thrown at him. She stood in the middle of their living room, arms crossed and eyes cold, her face hardened with determination. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind. "I'm done, James," Kate said, her voice eerily calm. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I can't keep pretending anymore. I'm tired of this marriage. I want out." James felt the floor beneath him shift. His knees nearly buckled as the reality of what she was saying hit him. He had always thought they were okay, no, more than okay. They'd had their struggles, sure, but they'd always come out the other side, stronger. But this? This was different. The coldness in her voice, the finality in her words, it left him speechless. "You're what?" James managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. "You're tired of our marriage? After everything we've been through?" Kate sighed and rolled her eyes as if she was explaining something simple. "Yes, James. I'm tired. I'm tired of the same old routine. Tired of being stuck in a marriage that's gone nowhere. And, honestly, I've already found someone who makes me feel alive again." The air felt thick, suffocating. James could barely breathe. His heart was racing, his thoughts scrambling. Someone else? She had been seeing someone else. The words didn't even feel real. "What do you mean by that? Are you saying?" He couldn't finish his sentence. The truth was too much to process. Kate's eyes never wavered from his. "I've been having an affair, James. I'm in love with him. I've made up my mind. I'm done." James staggered back as if he had been struck. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. His world had just come crashing down, and there she was, standing in front of him, offering him nothing but cold indifference. He had no words. No fight left in him. Not for her, not for their marriage. James had always believed in love, truly, deeply. He was the kind of person who valued commitment, who put everything he had into making a relationship work. He had fallen in love with Kate the moment they met. She was vibrant, full of life, and her laughter could light up even the darkest room. He loved the way she challenged him, the way they seemed to fit together, like two pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be joined. When they got married, James thought it was the beginning of a lifelong journey. Sure, there were challenges, there always were, but they had faced them together. They'd fought through financial struggles, job changes, and even moments of personal doubt. But with Kate by his side, he felt invincible. There was nothing they couldn't overcome, or so he believed. In the early years of their marriage, they were inseparable. They traveled together, explored new hobbies, and supported each other's dreams. Their passion for life and for each other never seemed to fade. James often thought that they were the lucky ones, the couple everyone else admired for how deeply they cared for one another. But as the years passed, something began to change. It was subtle at first, like a slow fade. The late-night conversations that used to go on for hours became shorter, more distant. They no longer laughed as much. Instead of planning their next adventure together, they'd talk about mundane tasks, finances, chores, the things that needed to be done around the house. There were still moments of intimacy, but they felt forced, like something they had to check off a list. The excitement that once defined their relationship started to feel like an obligation. James tried to keep the spark alive. He would surprise Kate with flowers, plan date nights, do little things to show her he cared. But Kate seemed different. She was always busy. She'd come home later and later from work, leaving James with the feeling that she was drifting away from him. When he asked her about it, she would shrug it off, saying she was tired or had too much on her plate. He wanted to believe her, to think that everything was fine, but a knot began to form in his stomach every time he saw her distant expression. There were moments when he'd catch her staring off into space, lost in thought, her mind clearly elsewhere. But every time he tried to confront her, she'd brush him off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're overthinking things," she'd say, and for a long time, James believed her. He trusted her. He didn't want to believe that something could be wrong with their marriage. So, he buried his suspicions, not wanting to rock the boat. But then came the signs, the small, subtle things that, in hindsight, should have been the red flags he couldn't ignore. First, it was the change in her behavior. Kate had always been outgoing and social, but she became more withdrawn, spending more time on her phone than with him. She started working late more often, saying she had to finish up important projects. But the late nights weren't just at the office. It was the weekends too. Suddenly, she was busy with friends, leaving James alone in the house with nothing but his thoughts. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, James began to feel like he was losing her. He tried to keep things normal, hoping it was just a phase, something that would pass. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence between them grew louder. He found himself looking for her, waiting for her to come home, but it was like she was a stranger walking through the door. Her eyes weren't the same anymore, and neither was her touch. James knew something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He told himself that maybe he was just being paranoid, that maybe he was imagining things. But deep down, he felt an undeniable shift. He wasn't the first person to wonder if their partner was drifting away, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But for James, it felt like a slow erosion of something precious. Then, one evening, everything changed. He had come home from a long day at work, exhausted and hoping for a quiet evening with Kate. She wasn't home, as usual. He had made dinner, set the table, and waited. When she finally came in, her face was flushed, her makeup slightly smudged, as though she had been crying or was trying to hide something. James didn't ask any questions at first, wanting to give her space. But then, as the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't until he accidentally caught her phone that he finally knew. She had left it on the kitchen counter while she went upstairs to change. It buzzed once, then twice, and without thinking, James grabbed it. He knew it was wrong, he knew that if he looked, he might uncover something he wasn't ready to face. But his curiosity got the best of him, and when he unlocked the phone, his heart dropped. There, staring at him from the screen, was a series of messages between Kate and another man, someone named Chris. The messages were flirtatious, intimate, full of inside jokes that only two people in a relationship could share. There was one message that stood out: "I can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." James's hands went cold as the world around him seemed to tilt. The room felt smaller, like the air had been sucked out of it. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he was seeing, what it all meant. He didn't want to believe it. This couldn't be happening. Kate couldn't be cheating on him, she just couldn't. But there was no denying it. The evidence was staring him in the face. When Kate came downstairs, James was standing in the kitchen, the phone still in his hand. She froze when she saw him, her face paling. She knew. She knew the moment their eyes met that the truth was out. There was no more pretending, no more lies. "James, she started, but her voice faltered as she saw the pain in his eyes. "You've been seeing him, haven't you?" James asked, his voice low and strained. He wasn't angry yet, just devastated. His heart was breaking in slow motion, piece by piece. Kate opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "But I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time, James. I've been trying to convince myself that everything would be okay, that we could fix it. But it's too late. I'm in love with him." The words were like daggers to James's heart. It wasn't the affair that hurt the most. It was the realization that Kate had already given up on him, that she had been emotionally absent long before she had found someone else. She had made her decision, and there was nothing he could do to change her mind. But what James didn't know was that this moment was only the beginning of the unraveling of everything he thought he knew about their marriage. What Kate had yet to realize was that James had been planning something too, something she would never see coming. The room was filled with an eerie silence. James stood there, still holding Kate's phone, the realization of her betrayal sinking deeper with each passing second. He could feel the weight of the truth settling on him like a heavy blanket, suffocating him, yet there was something strangely calm about it. His heart ached with disbelief, but he wasn't sure if it was anger, hurt, or just sheer shock. Kate, standing in front of him with tear-filled eyes, clearly expected some kind of emotional breakdown, some desperate plea for her to stay. But James didn't give her that. Instead, he took a deep breath, lowering the phone and looking her in the eyes. "So, it's true, then," he said quietly. The words weren't harsh, they weren't accusatory. They were simply factual. Kate blinked rapidly, the tears threatening to spill over. She opened her mouth to say something, to apologize, to explain herself, but James held up his hand. "I don't need you to explain, Kate. I've seen everything I need to see." The words hung in the air, thick with finality. Kate opened her mouth again, but this time, no words came. She stood frozen, watching as James processed the pain in a way she hadn't anticipated. She expected him to collapse in front of her, or maybe yell at her, demand answers, try to fix it. But he wasn't doing any of that. He was calm. Too calm. "You know," James continued, his voice now laced with a touch of bitterness, "I used to believe in us. I thought we had something special. But now, I see it. You've been gone long before tonight. This affair, this new life you've found with him, it's just the final nail in the coffin. But I'm not surprised." Kate's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean? You should be devastated. You should be begging me to stay, James. Why aren't you fighting for us? Don't you care anymore?" James took another breath, his eyes never leaving hers. The question hung between them, a cruel challenge. "I'm not fighting for something that's already dead, Kate. You've been checked out of this marriage for a long time. I didn't want to see it, but I knew. I knew you were slipping away. You were emotionally gone long before you physically left." The words hit Kate like a slap. For the first time since the confrontation began, she felt her resolve crack. She had been expecting guilt, remorse, maybe even some semblance of anger from James, but this? This was the kind of indifference she couldn't handle. It wasn't the rage she had anticipated, it was the silent, cold truth that her husband had already moved on. "No," Kate whispered, her voice shaking, "no, that's not true. You were never here, Kate," James interrupted, his voice steady. "And I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a phase, that we could fix it. I kept thinking if I did this, or did that, you'd come back. But I was fooling myself. The truth is, I've been alone for a long time. The affair didn't break me. It just confirmed what I already knew." Kate opened her mouth to speak, but the words were stuck in her throat. Her body was shaking, her mind racing as she processed his words. How did he know? How had he figured it out before she even said a word? She thought she had hidden it all so well, that her affair with Chris had been a secret she controlled. But here she was, exposed, no more lies, no more pretending. James looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying, but there was no anger in his eyes, only resignation. "You wanted to leave, Kate. You've been emotionally checked out, and you were looking for an escape. And you found it. But here's the thing, while you were out there living your double life, I was making plans too." Kate's face contorted in confusion. "What are you talking about? What plans?" James slowly walked over to the living room table, his eyes never leaving Kate. He reached for a folder she hadn't noticed earlier. With deliberate slowness, he opened it and pulled out a set of papers, laying them out on the table in front of her. I knew it was coming. I knew you were done, even if I didn't want to admit it. So, I started preparing for it. For me. Kate's heart dropped into her stomach. She stared at the papers, and her pulse quickened when she saw what they were. Divorce papers. Signed by James, ready for submission. He'd been preparing for the end of their marriage before she had even made the decision to leave. You've been planning this, she whispered in disbelief. James nodded slowly. I wasn't going to wait for you to decide for me. I wasn't going to let you take everything. I've been emotionally checked out for months now, Kate. I just didn't know how to let go. I was afraid of losing you. But once I saw what you were doing behind my back, once I knew you had already moved on, I realized I had nothing left to lose. Kate felt her legs weaken. She staggered back, clutching the edge of the couch for support. But I thought you would fight for us. Fight for me. Her voice was desperate now, cracking under the weight of her own guilt. I thought you loved me. James looked at her, his gaze unflinching. I loved you, Kate. I really did. But love isn't enough when it's one-sided. You stopped loving me a long time ago. And I couldn't keep fighting for something that wasn't there anymore. The air between them was thick with tension, but there was no turning back now. Kate had hoped that maybe, just maybe, James would beg her to reconsider. That he would cry, that he would scream at her, or even try to guilt her into staying. But what she got instead was a man who had already moved on, a man who had already started rebuilding his life, even before she had taken the first step. Don't you feel anything? Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's eyes softened for a moment, but his voice remained steady. Of course I feel something. I feel the loss of what we had. But it's over. You've already made your choice. Now, I'm making mine. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from resolution. It wasn't the kind that came from forgiveness. It was the kind that came from realizing that sometimes, the hardest thing to do was let go. And he had finally done that. Kate stood there, broken, her world crumbling in front of her. She had expected this to be her escape, her way out of a life that had begun to feel like a trap. But now, as she saw the man she once loved move on without her, she realized the depth of her mistake. She had destroyed something beautiful, and now, she would have to live with the consequences. James turned and walked away, leaving Kate standing in the wreckage of everything they had built together. The finality of it was deafening. The door clicked shut behind James, leaving Kate standing in the middle of the living room. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the weight of everything they had been, everything they had built together, was now a distant memory. She stood there, motionless, as if rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next. The papers on the table, the divorce papers that she had never seen coming, were a cruel reminder of the reality she now faced. She had thought that leaving him, that walking away, would be her liberation. She had convinced herself that this affair, this new relationship, was the escape she needed from the monotony of their marriage, from the disconnect that had slowly built between them. But now, in the emptiness that followed her decisions, she realized just how wrong she had been. For the first time in years, Kate felt truly alone. Her mind wandered back to the conversations they used to have, the laughter they shared, the intimacy that had once been a constant. She remembered the way James would hold her at night, the way he would brush a stray lock of hair from her face as they watched their favorite shows. She remembered the promises they made to each other, the future they had talked about, filled with dreams and plans for tomorrow. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had shifted, those promises had broken, and now, it was too late to fix any of it. The guilt in her chest began to fester. She had never expected it to end this way. She had thought that if she left, if she made her escape, she would feel relief, freedom. But all she felt now was a hollow emptiness, a void that her affair, her new life, couldn't fill. She had made a choice, but what she hadn't considered was the cost of that choice, the people it would hurt, the consequences she would have to live with. Kate walked over to the table and picked up the divorce papers. She stared at them for a long time, her eyes tracing the words she had never thought she'd see. James had already made up his mind. It wasn't just about her leaving him, it was about him moving on first, before she had even given him the chance to react. And that was what stung the most. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that, in the end, James had outgrown their marriage long before she had. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, trying to process the reality that her life was now shattered in ways she couldn't comprehend. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her actions were justified, that she deserved more. But now, all she had was the mess she had made, and no way to undo it. As the minutes passed, Kate's thoughts drifted to James. She had expected him to fight, to demand answers, to try and fix what was broken. But he hadn't done any of that. He had simply accepted the end, as if he had known it was inevitable. In some strange way, Kate realized, that was the most painful part. James hadn't fought because, in his heart, he had already moved on. Kate's phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at it, but the name on the screen made her heart sink. It was Chris, the man she had been seeing for the past few months. She didn't know why, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. The reality of her situation, of what she had done, was too much to face. She had thought she had everything under control, but now, she felt nothing but regret. For a brief moment, Kate wondered if there was a way to fix things, to go back and undo the damage. Could she reach out to James and beg for forgiveness? Could she rebuild what they had? But deep down, she knew it wasn't possible. James had already closed that door. His calmness, his acceptance of their marriage's demise, had been a silent declaration that he was done. And there was nothing she could do to change that. The thought left her empty. It was the realization that she had lost something precious, something irreplaceable. The man she once loved, the life they had built together, was gone. And all she was left with was a painful, bitter truth: she had pushed him away, and now she had no idea how to live with it. In the quiet of the empty house, Kate found herself reflecting on what had led them here. She had thought she was making the right decision, that leaving James would bring her the happiness and freedom she was craving. But now she understood that happiness couldn't be found in someone else. It couldn't be found in running away from your problems. And freedom was a lot more complicated than she had imagined. As the hours passed, Kate's thoughts turned inward. She was alone now, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her choices, the consequences of her actions pressing down on her. There was no going back, no way to erase the hurt she had caused. The damage had been done. But as she sat there, in the quiet aftermath of everything, Kate realized that perhaps this was her turning point. Could she find a way to rebuild her life from the wreckage? Could she find peace in the aftermath, despite everything she had lost? The story ends with Kate alone in the silence, her future uncertain. She has lost what she thought she wanted, and the journey ahead will be one of healing and self-discovery. But what lies ahead for her, and whether she will ever find redemption, is left open-ended.